Hey guys, Jake from 8020 Media here. Recently I did a video on Duramax LB7 performance upgrades, so we're going to keep the series going here and talk about the Duramax LLY today. Now, the LLY isn't the most desirable Duramax from a performance modification standpoint, mostly because it suffered a lot of overheating issues due to airflow restriction, but also because the transmission on it is relatively weak and can't handle a whole lot of additional power. Fortunately, we can address a couple of these issues, and just a couple basic bolt-on modifications can still give us some pretty good horsepower gains on the LLY. Today we're going to go ahead and talk about the best basic bolt-on upgrades for the LLY. While I would love to talk about turbochargers and fueling upgrades and some more advanced modifications, the LLY gets pretty expensive to mod once you start looking beyond that 400 to 500 wheel horsepower range. And so we're really going to keep it within a safe limit in this video and save those other topics for another one. All of these mods that we talk about can get you to the 500 wheel horsepower mark. However, I'm going to put the conservative range at 400 to 425 wheel horsepower, maybe up to 450 wheel horsepower. These are the mods that I'm going to recommend to help you get to those power levels without sacrificing reliability or needing to toss thousands and thousands of dollars into supporting modifications. First off, let's go ahead and talk about the power limitations of the LLY. The first thing that becomes a problem is the Allison 1000 transmission. The factory transmission is the weakest point, and it is definitely going to need transmission tuning somewhere around the 400 wheel horsepower mark. With transmission tuning, you can take it to 425, maybe up to 450 wheel horsepower, but anything above 450 is where you're going to lose a lot of reliability in your transmission, and you're eventually going to need a built transmission or an upgraded transmission. That's going to be the first and the most expensive limitation of this engine, and really probably one of the main things that is going to prevent you from wanting to push past the 450 wheel horsepower mark. However, if you do want to push past the 450 wheel horsepower mark, the next thing that you're going to run into is the need for a lift pump. Now, the lift pump is a great addition at any point. The LLY did not come with a lift pump from the factory, and so it certainly doesn't hurt to add one once you add tuning to your LLY. But you can typically hold off until about 500 wheel horsepower, which is when you're going to need that extra fuel flow to help support the rest of the fueling system. After the transmission and the lift pump, because the fueling system's good for quite a bit more power, you're going to get your next limitation with the stock turbocharger. Now, the stock turbocharger on the LLY is one of the biggest turbochargers I've ever used in a Duramax. It's very capable, and it can handle up to about 530 wheel horsepower if you want to kill it. If you want some type of reliability, it can get to about 500 wheel horsepower, but again, the reliability at those levels might still be a little bit questionable. A turbocharger is recommended at the 500 wheel horsepower mark, especially if you're trying to push beyond that. The injectors and the CP3 are actually very stout from the factory. Those can get up to about 600 wheel horsepower before you need to start looking at larger injectors or any type of CP3 supporting upgrades. One other consideration here that makes it even more expensive to start pushing past these levels is once you get up to around 600 wheel horsepower, bent rods become an issue. And so without really killing your bank account and getting into some more advanced modifications, the 425 wheel horsepower mark is probably the safe limit that you're going to want to stay at, unless you're looking to really push things and you've got a budget to do it. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the 4 modifications that I have on my list here. Now, the first one is the turbo inlet manifold. As I mentioned, the LLY is extremely prone to overheating, especially when towing. Now, that is caused by a lot of airflow restriction, and the biggest restriction is with the turbo inlet manifold. And so this is a modification that I recommend even if you're on a 100% stock truck and you don't even plan on tuning it. This is something that will help keep your EGTs down. It'll help you when towing, and it'll even provide a little bit of a performance benefit. But overall, this is 100% a reliability modification. It's going to lower EGTs. It's going to solve any of your overheating problems that you're having. And so it's the most important thing, especially once we start talking about adding additional modifications to the LLY. So now the second thing on our list is tuning, but before I talk about that, I'm going to skip to the third thing on my list because it goes along with the turbo inlet manifold in a way, and that's going to be a cold air intake or an upgraded intake system. As I mentioned, there's a lot of airflow restriction on these engines. The intake system is also a restriction, and so opening it up with a performance intake is going to help reduce your EGTs a little bit, as well as provide some power gains. It's a great foundation for other modifications like tuning, and you'll even get a little bit of fuel economy gains out of it as well. An intake, it's gonna run you about $300 to $400, but it's another great thing to really open up the airflow within the vehicle, and the performance gains from it are gonna compound once we start talking about tuning and other modifications here. And so to get rid of the airflow restriction, turbo inlet manifold, and an intake system, and those two should work really well. So now skipping back to the second thing on my list, that's going to be tuning and also transmission tuning. Tuning's where your big power gains are going to come from. EFI Live with transmission tuning is going to be your best setup. Once you start looking at 400 plus wheel horsepower, that's when you're going to need transmission tuning, and EFI Live is going to be your best option for doing that. Tuning in the mods on this list can get you close to the 500 or above the 500 wheel horsepower mark. Tuning's really the only thing that you need to add a lot of power, but it's extremely important to also look at supporting modifications for the tuning, because tuning makes more power by turning up the boost, and to do that, we're going to want to bring more air into the engine, and then we're going to want to get more air out of the engine. While tuning is the best thing, I always recommend the inlet manifold, an intake system, and then the fourth thing on our list here, which is an exhaust system. Now, the LLY did come with a catalytic converter. That does mean that the downpipe is separate from the cat back portion of the exhaust system. And so if you do want to keep your factory catalytic converter, you can upgrade the downpipe and you can upgrade the cat back portion of the exhaust. Upgrading the downpipe is probably going to be where you're going to see the majority of the horsepower gains as well as the EGT reduction, because the downpipe sits directly up against the turbo. So that's going to have the biggest impact on back pressure reduction, and back pressure reduction is what's going to improve the efficiency of your turbocharger, provide you those power gains, as well as lower your EGTs. The catback portion will still help lower your EGTs, provide a little bit of power gains, but again, the majority is going to come from the downpipe. The best exhaust system is going with a catless downpipe back option, but those might be hard to find and might not be the best advised just with everything going on with diesel trucks and the EPA today. If you're opting to keep your factory catalytic converter on there, I'd recommend at least a downpipe. And if you can afford a catback portion of the exhaust system as well, then that's definitely a great upgrade to add on. So those are the four things that really cover the basis for what you're going to need to get to 400 plus wheel horsepower, as well as to get there reliably. The turbo inlet manifold is going to be about $150, so that's a super cheap no-brainer. Tuning, once you add in transmission tuning, which even if you're not pushing 400 wheel horsepower, it certainly doesn't hurt to have it, especially if you have a high mileage LLY. So tuning with transmission tuning with EFI Live is probably going to run you around $1,500. We've got another $300 or $400 for the intake system, and then you're probably looking about $500 for the exhaust system as well. So if you add all of those things up, even with opting for a more expensive tuning option with EFI Live and transmission tuning, we're looking at a little over $2,000 to get you somewhere around 150 wheel horsepower and 200 plus torque power gains. A couple other things that I do want to talk about as supporting modifications, like I mentioned earlier, is the Y-bridge. The Y-bridge will help airflow. It'll add some decent power as well. It's not on this list because you don't necessarily need it unless you're really trying to push past 500 wheel horsepower, or if you have a big problem with EGTs, especially when towing. But the Y-bridge is also a little bit more expensive, and so something that is a great modification if you're willing to spend the money on it, but is not necessarily required for the modifications that we're talking about here. Another thing, again, not required unless you're pushing more significant power levels, is an external oil cooler. That'll help keep your engine temperatures down and prevent any overheating issues that the LLY is known for. And then the last thing is a lift pump. As I mentioned, a lift pump is something that doesn't hurt. You won't need it if you're keeping your truck within the power levels that I talked about in this video, but it's completely worth it just to help out your factory CP3 and your factory injectors, even if you're keeping things at lower power levels. Anyways, guys, that covers everything here. This should give you everything that you need to know to be able to somewhat reliably get to the 425 to 450 wheel horsepower mark. Going beyond that's going to require transmission upgrades. And then once you're talking about 500 plus, we're talking about turbochargers, fueling system upgrades, built transmission. We're gonna go ahead and save those for a different video because those get expensive. I hope you guys appreciate this video. If you did, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned as I'll continue to put out more LLY and Duramax related performance upgrade videos.